An unplowed field produces food for the poor, but injustice sweeps it away. Now you're probably sitting there wondering, what's he going to preach on in that? Because quite frankly, I don't think I would have, except I was looking through Alexander McLaren's sermons from Proverbs, and the title of one of them just jumped off the page at me. The Tillage of the Poor. What? The tillage of the poor? What in the world does that mean? Well, that's the King James translation of this verse. Much food is in the tillage of the poor, but there is that is destroyed for lack of judgment. But, that's kind of intriguing, and so I kind of started looking over his sermon, and I started getting excited. And then I remembered a message of his that I read, over 30 years ago, about Silas and John Mark from 1 Peter chapter 5. And God put those two thought processes together in my mind. And so giving a lot of credit to Alexander McLaren for preaching a sermon on the tillage of the poor, we're going to look at this verse and its application for us. Here's the paraphrase of the verse. It basically means this. The poor, hard-working person, by God's blessing, makes a living. A lot of rich people are ruined because of their injustice and lack of judgment. And we've all lived long enough to know that that's true. The tillage of the poor. In the days of Solomon, most of the farmers in Israel had small, modest plots of ground. Leviticus chapter 27 verse 24 says that in the year of Jubilee, all land had to go back to the original owner. And so that tended to discourage land grabs. Why would you amass a bunch of property if in the year of Jubilee you had to give it back to its rightful owner? And so therefore, the bulk of the farming in the Holy Land in the days of Solomon was done on small plots of land by relatively poorer people. There weren't a lot of big, rich landowners in that day. And it was through the faithful tending of those small farms that the storehouses of Israel remained full. Now, when you stop and think about that, you realize that that's true of most things. Most large accomplishments are done because a lot of people did a lot of small things to end up with a large project. Anybody that's ever tried to put together a banquet or anything has understood how important it is to have a lot of people each doing their own responsibility. And as I was reading McLaren's sermon, I read this. Many littles make a mickle. Wonder what that means. Many littles make a mickle. Well, a mickle means a lot. Large in size or great in size. So it basically says a lot of little things put together can accomplish a big thing. So when somebody asks you, what did you learn in church Sunday? Said, I learned what a mickle is. And they'll be impressed. So from this concept, the tillage of the poor, everybody doing their part to accomplish something for God, what are the lessons for us? Number one, we are responsible for what we have. Whether it's big or small, we're responsible for what we have. The New Testament passage that teaches us this is Matthew chapter 25. You don't have to turn there. You're probably vaguely familiar with the story at least. It's when the landowner calls together his 3 servants and he gives them talents, which were units of money. He gave one 5, he gave another 2, and he gave another one 1. Right off the bat, and it's hard not to preach on that whole parable, right off the bat we have to remember that who receives what is up to the boss. The gifts, the abilities that you have were given to you by God. The gifts and abilities somebody else has were given to them by God. Now, so if you have a question or a quarrel with why you didn't get what they can do, you got to take it up with God. Because He's the one, in fact, in the passage in Corinthians about the gifts of the Spirit, it says He gives to them as He chooses. So nobody can lord it over somebody else because they think their gift is better than somebody else's, because whatever abilities and gifts that we have been given by God. And so the landowner gives out. One has 5, one has 2, one has 1, and you know the story. He comes back sometime later, asks for an account. The Bible tells us that when we get to heaven, we're going to give an account for what we did with what we had. The one who had been given 5 talents goes to the boss and says, I doubled it, here's 10. The one who had 2 talents goes to the boss and said, I doubled it, here's 4. And if you will read that passage, and it's Matthew 25, starting in verse 14. If you will read that passage, you will find that the landowner gives the exact same praise and promotion to both of those men. Word for word, the exact same praise and the exact same promotion. But wait a minute. One had 10 and one had 4. How is that worthy of equal promotion and equal praise? Because God's not interested in how much you have, He's interested in what you did with it. And the one with 5 doubled his, the one with 2 doubled his. Now the one with 1 talent said to the master, I was afraid that if I put this, an investment or tried to do something with it, that I would lose it. And I knew that you were strict and I didn't want to lose what you gave me, so here's your 1 back. And you may remember that he gets scathingly rebuked. And he says, you should have done something with it. And what he has is taken from him. The lesson is we are responsible for what God has given us. Whether you think you have 1 talent or 2 talents or 5 talents or 150 talents, you're responsible for what you've been given, and it has been given to you by God, regardless of how big or small it is. Which leads me to the second lesson, and that is we are expected by God to develop what we've been given. We're expected to develop what we've been given. Not just take it and hide it in the ground, but develop it. The word that the King James translates tillage means ground that has been worked for the first time. Now, I'm not a farmer, but I understand that the first time you go in and break up soil and get it ready to plant is harder than subsequent years. And so he's talking about the hard work, the groundbreaking work to get a field ready to produce a harvest. It's hard work. I remember a story of a preacher who was visiting one of his farmers, and he was talking about the crops and how great the farm was, and he said God has really done a great job on this farm. And the farmer looked at him with a little smirk on his face and said, you should have seen this place when God had it by himself. And Jay said, amen, right? Because, it takes work to develop what we've been given. And so many times our temptation is to think, if I had something great to do for God, boy, I'd do that. If I had something great, I'd do that. But my little doesn't make any difference, so I won't worry about developing that. No. Again, a preacher and a farmer having a discussion about the blessings of God. And the preacher said, man, God has blessed you so much. I would imagine if you had 2 farms, you'd give one of them to the Lord. He said, yes, preacher, I would. It just God has been so good. He said, I imagine if you had 2 houses, you'd give one of them to God. He said, yes, sir, you know I would. God has been so good to me, I would give him one. He said, I imagine if you had 2 cows, you'd give one of them to God. And the farmer said, preacher, that's not fair. You know I've got 2 cows. Right? We're willing to do something big. Oh, if I could only give $1 million to God, if I could. I've had people tell me, preacher, I'm going to play the lottery. And when I win, I'm going to tithe to the church. And what I did, you will be so proud of me because I didn't say it. But what I wanted to say was, why don't you tithe your salary now instead of waiting to win the lottery to start tithing, right? You know, we're all willing to do something big. God expects us to develop what we have. No matter how small it may be, he expects us to develop what we've been given. 1 Corinthians chapter 1, starting in verse 26, brothers and sisters, think of what you were when you were called. Not many of you were wise by human standards. Not many were influential. Not many were of noble birth. But God chose the foolish things of the world to shame the wise. He chose the weak things of the world to shame the strong. He chose the lowly things of the world and the despised things and the things that are not to nullify the things that are, so that no one may boast before him. What you have has been given to you by God. You are responsible to develop it. No matter how small you think what you have to offer is, it's important. Because let's face it, the majority of us are 2-talent or 1-talent people. There aren't a whole lot of 5-talent people in the kingdom. And so if everybody who were 2 talents and 1 talent said, well, I'm not the 5 talent, so I can't do anything, nothing would get done. Because the majority of work that gets done in the kingdom of God is done by just ordinary people using their ordinary gifts for the glory of God. Alexander Pope wrote this: act well your part. There all honor lies. And I found that as I was working on this lesson, and I saw a little blog post by a stagehand. Said that all the way through his college career, he was always backstage, working with costuming and those kind of things. He said, I never once got any time on stage. And he said that post from Alexander Pope was in big letters backstage. Act well your part. There all honor lies. And he said it was a constant reminder to those of us who never took a bow, who never had the spotlight on us, who never had our name in the program. It was a reminder to us that we were important too. And each of us has to play our part. That's where the honor is. Doing what God has called you to do. And you ask any actor or actress, and they will tell you that if the costuming people don't do the right job. Have you ever been to a play when the curtain lowered at the wrong time? You know, the person that runs the curtain is an important person. You know, it's all important. Do your part. That's where the honor is. And that's God's truth. You know, at judgment, God is not going to come to me and say, Wilson, how come you weren't Rick Warren? Or how come you weren't Andy Stanley? Or how come you weren't Charles Stanley? He's going to say, why weren't you a better Ken Wilson? Right? You know, he's expecting us to develop what he's given us. Stop comparing yourself to other people. Because when you do that, you either arrogantly come out a whole lot better than them, or, you know, very poorly come out worse than them. No. Do what God's given you to do. Be faithful to what he's given you to do. Because, lesson number 3, little is much when God is in it. That's a song. As I was working on this truth, I read about coral reefs. You may know about coral reefs. One of the churches I pastored, I had a guy who was in the hospitality business, and on his dime, he flew me to one of his properties in Key West and put me up for a couple of days and treated me nice. That was cool, man. It was great. But I noticed something about the beaches of Key West. There's no waves. There's no surf. It's just smooth. Because, I don't know how far offshore it is, there's a reef, a coral reef. And the waves smash on that coral reef and can't get past it. And so from the coral reef in, it's just like a lake, just perfectly smooth. You may know about the Great Barrier Reef off of Australia. I understand it's so large that it can actually be seen from space. Do you know how coral reefs are made? I just learned this week. They are made up of little animals called coral polyps. They're related to jellyfish. They secrete calcium carbonate. Most of them are 4/100ths to 12/100ths in diameter. That's itty bitty. 4/100ths to 12/100ths in diameter. But when they get together, when hundreds and thousands and millions of them all get together, their colonies that we call coral reefs can weigh several tons. Little is much. That little coral polyp by itself can't do anything, but it gets together with a bunch of its brothers and sisters, and it can stop the waves of an ocean. What an illustration of the biblical truth, that when each of us does our part, no matter how small it may be, great things can be accomplished. One of the parts of my life that I look back at and smile a lot is when Brian was coaching football and basketball, and I would watch game film with him. And I tell you, if you want to learn a sport, watch the film with a coach, because they see things nobody else sees. And he'd say, oh, look, you got to see this, you got to see this. And he showed me a play that just popped open for a touchdown. It was just unbelievable. And he said, but let me show you why that play worked. And he backed up, the film from on high where you could see the whole field. And he said, see this fellow over here? Watch what he does. The ball is not coming to him. The play is not going to his side of the field. But you watch what he does. Because he did this and then did this and then did this, this linebacker had to come over here, this defensive back had to guard over here, this fella swung over here, and as a result of that, our line blocked these guys this way, and this fella was wide open for the touchdown. He said, now, and he fast forwarded, he said, watch this play. Looked like the same play, except nothing good happened. He said, now, watch what the kid on the other side of the field did. The kid on the other side of the field had decided the ball is not coming to me, the play is not coming to my side of the field, so I'm just going to stand here. Because my running this route and stuff is stupid because I'm not getting the ball. So he stood there. He said, now watch what happens. Because he stood there, the defensive back went this way, and the safety went that way, and everybody flooded the other side of the field to where the play was going to go. And because that one kid decided what I did was not important, instead of having a touchdown, we took a loss. And he said the hardest thing in coaching was to get teenagers to realize that even if the ball isn't coming to you, what you're supposed to do on this play is essential to making the play work. And a good coach, and I've watched Brian do this, a good coach, when that kid on the other side of the field, who maybe didn't get a ball thrown to him the entire game, but who consistently ran his route and did his job, Brian, while the other people are high-fiving the quarterback and the receiver that caught the touchdown, Brian's over with that kid, chest bumping him and high-fiving him because you did your job. And because you did your job, this play happened. That kid's name was never in the paper, right? But he was essential to making the play work. And there's a lot of things in the kingdom of God, and you're not going to get your name in the newsletter, and they're not going to have a day for you, and they're not going to give you a plaque. But when you get to heaven, the God who says, a cup of cold water in my name will have its reward, I don't know if God's going to chest bump you and high five you, but he's going to say, well done, good and faithful servant. Maybe you never got the ball thrown to you, but I saw what you did, and you were faithful in what you did, and that made possible everything else. Little is much if God is in it. Which is what led me back to 1 Peter chapter 5. You don't have to turn there, but in 1 Peter chapter 5, verses 12 and 13, Peter mentions Silas and Mark. These two men are biblical examples of the tillage of the poor. Silas, you know about him because you know his first name, right? Silas's first name was Pauland, right? Because all we know is Paul and Silas. We never hear about Silas, we hear about Paul and Silas. I wonder if his family called him and Silas. Oh, here comes and Silas. Where's Paul? Don't know, but here's and Silas. In Acts chapter 15, he was a chief person at the church in Jerusalem. And when the controversy came up about circumcision, he stayed in Antioch. Now, he was like the lead deacon in Jerusalem. He comes to Antioch to help smooth over a situation. And guess who shows up at Antioch? Paul. And suddenly, Silas, the chief man of Jerusalem, becomes and Silas. He goes with Paul on his second missionary journey. He's in prison with Paul at Philippi in Acts chapter 16. He's mentioned a couple of times in 1 and 2 Thessalonians, 2 Corinthians 9, just by name. Now he's attached to Peter. Paul has been martyred. Peter is now the lead apostle, if you will. And Silas is still and Silas. Instead of being Paul and Silas, it's now Peter and Silas. One of the chief people of the church at Jerusalem, headquarters, spends his entire ministry playing second fiddle to Paul and Peter and Silas. But that teaches us the importance of supportive work. Little is much if God is in it. There's not one word that Silas spoke recorded in Scripture. He couldn't do Paul's work, but he could share the beatings of Paul and the imprisonments of Paul. He couldn't do Peter's work. His job was to carry the letter back to the church. That's why 1 Corinthians chapter 12, Paul says the parts of the body that don't seem to be so important are really important. One of the churches that I pastored, there was a mechanic there, and I was preaching on this truth, and he came up to me after service. He says, "Let me tell you about a transmission." He said, "I had a transmission in my shop that would not go in reverse." He said, "There's a little bitty old switch on the inside of that transmission. It cost 59 cents. It broke. The whole transmission stopped working." And little is much if God is in it. The importance of supportive work and the importance of faithfulness. Christ will not forget your work and labor of love. Be faithful. Silas is faithful first to Paul. Now he's faithful to Peter. Faithfulness, one of the greatest attributes that a person can have. And then John Mark, he was probably Barnabas' cousin. You remember that Paul and Barnabas went on the first missionary journey. They took Mark with them, and for some reason Mark left. And it caused such a division between Paul and Barnabas that you had the first church split, and Paul went his way, and Barnabas took his cousin and went his way. And it's interesting that now both Silas and Mark are with Peter. Because after Acts chapter 15, where Peter and Barnabas break up over Mark, we don't hear a word about Mark for 12 years. Until Colossians chapter 4, when Paul's in prison, and he says, "Mark has been a comfort to me." Wow. And later in 2 Timothy chapter 4, Paul said, "Bring Mark to me because he's helpful to me." You know, that ministry that once he abandoned, he's now helpful for. And that tells me that it's possible to overcome past mistakes. The devil will tell you if you blew it once, you can't ever do anything. Oh, no. He had deserted Paul. But now He's at his side in prison. And now he's ministering to Peter. You can succeed even in areas where in the past you may have failed. And again, the same lesson, the tillage of the poor. There's greatness in supportive ministry. We don't read a single sermon that Mark ever preached. We don't know if he ever preached a sermon. Apparently, his job was taking care of first Paul and then Peter's physical needs and material needs. You know, if Mark would have been like us, he'd have said, I don't understand this. Because Paul sends Timothy over here and gives him a church, and he talks about how eloquent Apollos is. I'm carrying books around. That's basically what he did. He said, tell Mark to come see me and bring my books. But when everything works together to the same end, everything's important, and it's all part of the same work. When we had a larger church and we had babies and we had nursery workers, I tried to consistently remind the nursery workers that while you're in the back taking care of crying babies so mamas and dads can pay attention to the sermon and one of them gets saved, you've got a part in that. Because if they'd have been tending to that crying baby, they would not have been able to hear and respond. Every part is the same work. Who flew the kite? You ever seen somebody out flying a kite? Who flew the kite? I did, said the paper. No, I did, said the string. No, I did, said the tail. No, I did, said the wind. No, I did, said the boy. But it took them all working together to get the job done. And the lesson is that faithfulness in the things that we look at as smaller tend to lead to larger opportunities of ministry. Mark is the one who wrote the Gospel of Mark, the unique gospel. Which is why Jesus says in Luke 16, whoever can be trusted with very little can be trusted with much. And whoever's dishonest with little will be dishonest with much. And why in that parable of Matthew 25 of the talents, Jesus said, well done, good and faithful servant. You've been faithful for a few things. I'll put you in charge over many things. Much food is in the tillage of the poor. God has given you what you have. You're responsible to develop it. And when you develop it, you will learn that little is much when God is in it. And much food is in the tillage of the poor. Father, thank you for that truth. So many times, if we're not careful, we buy into the world's value system that more is better or fancier is better. And what you're calling us to do is be faithful to what you've given us. And so, Lord, may we be encouraged by that and remain faithful to you. Many of us probably feel like we're Ann Silas, that we're never top billing, we're never the person on the front lines, we never throw the touchdown pass or catch the touchdown pass, we're over on the side making a fake. But Lord, help us to realize that whatever you've put us here to do and whatever you have gifted us to do is essential. And as we are faithful to you, things get accomplished. And I really believe, Lord, that probably when we get to heaven, we will be most surprised over the fact of how much was accomplished because of things that we did that we really didn't think mattered. But it mattered to you, and it mattered to somebody else, and it mattered to your kingdom. So maybe we're one of those little tiny, can barely see coral polyps. Help us to do our job for great things for the kingdom of God. Now may the Lord bless you and keep you. May he make his face to shine on you and give you his peace now and evermore. Amen. God bless you. Thanks for coming out today.